It's a pleasure being here. Like I said, I'm the Chief Economist at the Banking Standards Board. It's a pleasure really that Celia's over here. I mean, we're a very young organization. We started in 2015, and Celia's been our principal academic advisor on all of the assessment work that we do with firms for the past 3 years. And when we started with Celia, she was at the London Business School, and she was teaching organizational behavior, but also ethics to MBA students. She's moved over to Bocconi, but the engagement continues. From our side, well, the Banking Standards Board is a pretty new organization. What's sort of the inception of this? What's the journey? Well, the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards, after the financial crisis, but really after several conduct issues in the banking sector after this, thought something needed to be done beyond regulation. And on the retail side, as you know, there's been PPI issues. On the wholesale side, this was just after LIBOR, this was just after FX manipulation. And the PCBS's question was, is this really about rogue individuals, or are we talking about something where systemically there's a cultural issue in banking? This led eventually to the Banking Standards Board being set up. And what we're here for is a single purpose, though a difficult one, which is to help raise standards of behavior and competence at firms. We're not a statutory body. We have no regulatory powers as such. But this puts us in a position where we can ask firms to really open themselves up to us. And the promise is, if they open themselves up to us, we can hold back a mirror and say, this is what you look like, and this is what you look like relative to other firms. And this is what we've been trying to do. And it's like John mentioned, it's a fuzzy concept. How do you go about trying to assess, trying to measure culture, behavior? How can we do this? So this is sort of a little bit about our journey and how we did this over the last 3 years and how we're continuing to do this. So the first thing to say is, there's a lot of models out there. Cultural diagnostic tools, a lot of firms work in this space, consulting firms, academics, banks themselves, they've got their own models. And we looked at a lot of these, cultural models, engagement models, risk culture models. What the best of firms were able to say about these things was that their models correlated with long-term shareholder value. Now we, as the Banking Standards Board, are interested in consumer outcomes, societal outcomes, and outcomes for the 400,000 people, the employees who work directly in banking. So while we're interested in long-term shareholder value and we're interested in financial stability as such, it's not our core purpose. And part of the difficulty is measurement. How do you go about measuring consumer outcomes in financial services where there's so much information asymmetry, where there are so many behavioral biases that by asking people, you're not going to get to the answer. And I think that's part of the reasons that firms aren't able to match what they're doing to consumer outcomes at the end. So we ended up building our own framework. And so the starting point, consumer outcomes, societal outcomes, outcomes for employees. But we know that culture in firms is different, right? Building society is going to be different from a digital startup, is going to be different from a universal bank to a small organization. And even a large organization is going to have multiple types of cultures within it. So is there a right culture, a great culture, one that we should say all firms should have? That doesn't seem sensible. What did we end up doing? We ended up creating a characteristic framework. So what this does not say is this is the culture that a firm should have. What this says is to be able to get to good consumer outcomes, good social outcomes, good employee outcomes, we proposition that a firm's culture, whatever that culture is like, if it demonstrates these characteristics, it's likely to lead to those outcomes. And if you look at this stuff, on the left-hand side, what we've got is ethical or behavioral concepts: honesty, respect, openness, accountability. And on the right-hand side, what we're talking about over here is capability: competence, reliability, responsiveness, personal and organizational resilience. And what we don't mean is resilience in the Bank of England sense of prudential or liquidity. This is about well-being. This is about individuals. This is about organizations being able to bounce back. And in the center of this is shared purpose. And where does this all come from? This comes from looking at the empirical literature. This comes from looking at case studies of banking failure and failure of other organizations, especially on conduct issues. So we know speaking up is important, which is covered in openness and accountability. We know from the sort of latest lens that behavioral science is going into that well-being is important not just for individuals, but because of bounded ethicality reasons, that people eventually, when their well-being is worn down, start acting in ways which aren't all that ethical. So we looked at the literature, we looked at what existed outside, and we tried to come up with this framework. This is what we've ended up with. Now, before we get into the measurement of this, there's many different ways that you can go in trying to understand culture, behavior, competence. And there's several ways that are used. And this is not the best sort of spectrum labeling from big data to thick data, but let's live with this for a sec. On that end, what we're talking about are things like machine learning. And there's a growing sector out there. What are these firms doing? They're basically scraping communications, emails, interactions, messages, other data like that of people within organizations. They're tying it to behavioral outcomes, applying machine learning, and trying to say, here's cultures, here's pockets of cultures, pockets of different behavior which might be difficult for a firm, which might lead to bad outcomes. And we actually explored this possibility. We had two concerns. And when we started talking with firms about this stuff about 3 years ago, one of the concerns was that the agencies supplying this were not necessarily able to show the predictive power of their tools, having not run it across a huge range of organizations for us to feel comfortable with this. The second is, this is invasive in nature. What you're taking is every communication of individuals working within organizations. So there's a sort of ethical aspect to this as well. More traditionally, people use survey-based approaches. We use a survey-based approach as well, but there's many, many different ways of doing this, from pulse stuff to engagement surveys but the design of these things really, really matters. And Celia's sort of the expert in this. There's stuff like outcome data and indicators from firms, which is important to triangulate. Because surveys are perceptions, experiences, observations. You want to triangulate this stuff. There's others who do experiments, and these can tell you about little bits of culture. And there's a famous one by Alain Kohn and these guys, they did something where, if you search for dishonesty in banking in Google, you can find the experiment where for some bankers in one group, what they did was they primed their identity as a banker and made them do a coin toss game, which tells you, whether you're being honest on sort of these responses or not. And then they primed people not as bankers, or bankers not as bankers, but in their home life. So they made that identity more salient. And there was a difference they found in the level of dishonesty. So you can try through experimental games for people to reveal their preferences when certain identities are made more salient. So there's other ways of getting to this as well. Textual analysis, I think, is partly trying to do the same because it's trying to get to psychology rather than content itself. And again, that's something that we're exploring. Interviews, focus groups, traditional techniques, but what's really important is how do you analyze this? We'll talk about how we try to do this as objectively as possible. Right-hand side, thick data, we're talking ethnography. Now, ethnography is very interesting. We actually do work with ethnography as well. What we've done with the London School of Economics is, this is the second year, we're teaching a second cohort of people from banks how to apply ethnography in their own spaces to try and understand real deep-seated issues. Real deep-seated causes where you can't understand things from just survey data or other data points like that. And I remember talking to Daniel Boenser the first time I met him, who teaches ethnography for us to the firms. And he explained it to me like this. He said, when you walk to work every day, what you'll notice is sometimes tourists are taking pictures of things which you don't notice on a day-to-day basis at all. And the idea is that in our environments, we become blind. So how do you take the blinders off? And that's the idea of teaching ethnography. The problem is applying it across many, many spaces is very time-intensive and costly. But there's a range of sort of approaches. We've taken some of these approaches. Celia, do you want to say something about the survey and how we developed it?
Yeah, so you'll see, I mean, you probably won't be able to read, and it's not important for you to read, the list of questions that we use in the survey that goes out annually to 28,000.
Well, the first year was 28,000 responded. The next year was 36,000. I think this year there's about 70,000 responding to it. So, yeah.
Many, many, many British bankers respond to this set of questions. And we spent many, many hours together in small rooms hashing out what each of the items was going to be. Now, this is a survey. And as Kumar mentioned, all surveys are sort of imperfect measurement. I'm actually reading a book right now about the nature of quantification in Western society. So before there were Hindu Arabic numerals, no one measured anything quantitatively. And Plato and Aristotle actually thought that trying to measure anything quantitatively was just a load of crap and we shouldn't do it because what really mattered was quality. And you can see over the course from like 1300 on how we have slowly been taken over by this compulsion need to measure things quantitatively, even things as fuzzy as culture. And so there's a couple things that I just want to say as we design the survey. One is that we acknowledge that all measurement of this type is imperfect. I was actually really jealous, and I'm not saying that it's simple, but I was jealous of thinking about traffic flows because quanta of cars is a thing you can measure. You can measure how many cars pass by a certain traffic light in a day. Getting an accurate measurement of what a firm's culture is with survey data is nearly impossible. The second thing that we all need to remember is that we need to make sure that the things we're asking are measuring what we think they're measuring. So how many people work at an organization where they have some kind of pulse check, climate culture survey that they have to fill out every year? Like, yeah, see? And a lot of firms actually just do this as an exercise to see whether or not the bars go up or down and aren't really clear about if they're measuring what they think they're measuring. So I'm going to give you an example of an item that isn't in the survey, but which we fought a lot about because some of the people in the room wanted to have an item that said, people around here are motivated, something to that. And I said, so what is that measuring, right? People answer that item. You are accessing people's perceptions, general perceptions of how motivated other people are in their environment. Do they have access to that? Not really. So what would be a more direct way of measuring that notion? You could ask 70,000 people, I'm motivated to come to work, right? You aggregate that up to the organizational level, that's a closer proxy to people's self-perceptions of how motivated they are at work. Now, people are inclined to think that they're pretty awesome, and so you're going to get higher than realistic responses to a lot of those items, like a lot of the items in a lot of pulse check type surveys. So what would be another way of measuring that? If you said, how many times this month did you stay late or come early because you were so excited to come to work? If you got a response to that, you'd have access to a self-reported behavior that sort of taps motivation directly from a behavioral lens. So what we're talking about is how do you get closer and closer to what you are actually trying to measure? And we try to do that with the survey. Now, sometimes people's perceptions of the general environment matters, especially when it comes to ethics. Right? So one of the items we have here is, it is difficult to make career progression in my organization without flexing my ethical standards. We can't ask questions like, I flex my ethical standards to get my job done. Because 100% of people are going to say, no, I am perfect all the time, and I never do that. But people's perceptions of a firm's culture, if people perceive that they can't get ahead without flexing their ethical standards, actually taps something important about the organization. So that's another thing that we really focused on. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? One other quick caveat is not to be afraid of asking negatively worded items. So because a lot of people, when they design surveys like this, are imagining the pretty bar charts that come at the end, right? They tend to want to word everything, it's a great place to work here. And year after year, it's like 89%, 88%, and everyone worries that it's gone down 1%. It's not meaningful. Think about items where you're going to get a lot of variance and actually get what you're looking for. Because we had a fight about this question too. We could have asked that question, people who are ethical get ahead in this organization. And then a lot of people would say, like, yes, that's true. But that actually doesn't get at what we want. So this is the set of items that we set, and Kumar is going to tell you about how they play out when 70,000 people have responded to them. And then I'll come back in a little bit.
So all of these questions, by the way, are sort of strongly agree to disagree scale. And there's additional questions we ask to drill into themes and so on, but this is the core part of the survey we do. My favorite one is actually the one that's at the last. There's no conflict between my organization's stated values and how we do business. It's the sort of question that a firm won't ask internally. And what we find is that, there's a question before that on shared purpose. My organization's purpose and values are meaningful to me. A very high percentage of people tell us that their organization's purpose and values are meaningful to them. But when they're asked about, is there a conflict between these, there's many less people who are saying there's no conflict between these values as stated and how we actually do business. And so we try and understand what's going on behind that. And by the way, on that specific one, what we found was a spectrum of things, right? At the one end, there were firms who said, their values were simple, flexible, innovative. People said, this is bureaucratic, stale, slow-moving, right? So that's a nature of a conflict. The more sort of problematic nature of a conflict is when a firm says, we're customer-centric. And then people say, what's going on? We've got a business model where we've got a teaser rate, and what we're trying to do is exploit people's behavioral biases. Once we have them in, we'll raise it, right? Or people will say, this is a business model which is inherently flawed in some way. And those are issues which are much more problematic about banking rather than the first type. So we do the survey. We do a huge amount of interviews, focus groups, and other stuff as well. In terms of the survey, I think this is the 2017 stuff. So the green things are retail, blue is the functional areas within banks, orange is commercials, and the reddish part is investment banking. Each of these blocks is sort of a bank. And what you'll notice immediately is large 4 banks make up much of the UK banking population, right? Large 6, in fact, make up almost everything. And then you've got minute firms. So every year, the number of firms doing this has been increasing. In this country, there's about 400,000 people who work in banking. Our stuff, at least last year, covered firms who had a little bit more than 300,000 people. This year, it's got sort of more. The nature of the firms themselves, we're talking about international banks like Citi and Morgan Stanley. We're talking about the really large ones here, RBS and HSBC and Barclays. We're talking about building societies like Nationwide's, challengers like Atom. So it's a sort of spectrum of different banks that are over here. There are sort of 2 steps we're going to go through from now. One step is to say, what do we do with the information that we get? How do we present it back to firms themselves? We do sort of 2 things. What we have is an analytical engine. Survey goes to firms. Oh, by the way, before I go into that, how do we actually compare firms, right? Because these, like I said, they seem really incomparable firms to some extent. So what we do is we map them to a common hierarchy. We say you've got a UK firm, you've got investment banking, retail banking, commercial banking, and functions underneath it. And underneath each of these categories, each of these buckets, you've got more granular categories. So for example, we take investment banking and we say, here's your trading business. Here separately is your corporate finance and M&A business. Here separately is your research business. And we map firms' businesses to those areas specifically. So firms, when we benchmark them, we don't benchmark them just on the firm stuff. We benchmark them, here's your risk and compliance compared to risk and compliance across industry. Here's your trading areas against everybody's trading areas, retail branches against retail branches, and so on. Right? We give firms 2 products. One's an almost automated product. What happens is survey information, et cetera, comes in. We have an analytical engine, builds up the scores, spits out visualizations. I'm not able to show you the dashboard itself, but just to say how transparent we are about these things in terms of what firms get. So these are sort of box and whiskers. In this case, it's characteristics, but you can imagine them being any question for any area of a firm. So let's look at this one, for example. So 2016, 2017, 2018. 2018, we've got the box and whisker. Each of the dots is a score of a different firm, right? So we don't say, here's HSBC and here's Barclays, but we say, here's every firm on the spectrum. top, bottom, median, everything. Here's you yourself. That's sort of the pink line over here. Here's where you were the year before, and here's where you were the year before, right? So increasing on responsiveness over here. I mean, strictly speaking, what we're giving them is this, actually, but it's a bit more complicated, but still the same, right? Box and whisker, box and whisker, box and whisker. Tell them transparently exactly where you are. Why is this important? People give you ranks, they give you quartiles. They don't really tell you how different industry is. What you can aspire to actually be, what's really possible within banking. And so we try to be really, really transparent about this. We do it at each level, at each question, and so on. And then after that automated process, which gives different types of visualizations and so on, heat maps and stuff like that, we give a report near the end of the year to the boards of each of these firms. And that's important because in the end, the boards are the stewards of the culture of their firm. And so boards sign up to us, boards understand what's going on, and of course the executives need to know, and we engage with them all throughout this. But boards in the end are stewards of this. The reports themselves are pretty challenging because beyond this, what we do is we do focus groups, we do interviews. Over 2 years, I think we've spoken to about 1,500 employees. I remember doing a board interview about 2 years ago, and the board member saying to me after the interview, which went on for, I don't know, an hour and a half or 2 hours, even though it was an hour-long slot, and she said, this felt like going to confessional after many years. So, which is to say, what we've managed to do is build trust. Because if we were a regulator, it's slightly different to have those types of conversations. And that's why these are private conversations with firms to show them where they are. The second step to tell you is, well, now we've got this database. What do we do with this to understand what's happening across sector? And we've got a range of factors on each of the individuals, which firm they're from, which year the data's from, where they are in the hierarchy, geographically, and so on. And the way we analyze this is a series of models. So we start with an ordinal logic model. Why? Because we've got strongly agree to disagree. It's an ordinal scale. And then we use a series of other models to try and validate this stuff. But very, very simply, how do we present this? Because this was our problem. How do you go out and make an impact when you've got loads of information, right? Generally, you're running a regression. You've got one sort of regression to run, yes? So what is an ordinal logic model? It's just telling you the answer for a specific variable against a base, right? So we know 2017 against 2016, controlling for everything else we can control for. Results for women relative to men, controlling for everything else we can control for. It just gives you an odds ratio greater than 1. It's got a more positive impact than the base, less than 1 the other way around. So in the end, what is a regression? Regression's just got two things going for it, right? A coefficient, an odds ratio in this case, which is the size of the impact, and then whether or not it's negative, whether it's statistically significant, and whether it's got a negative or positive impact. So we distilled this into something visual, and we said, well, the size of the impact is just the size of a ball, right? Greater than 1, it starts going like this. Less than 1, and as it moves away from 1, it starts getting bigger, right? And the color, green, positively statistically significant, red, negatively statistically significant. And we said, here's 36 questions, right? So each of these is a regression. But instead of reading regressions like you read regressions, you can now start looking across variables on all of these things. And it immediately shows you patterns, which 36 pages of tables are not going to show you. And so if we just look at a couple of these things, I mean, the top line is 2017 relative to 2016. It says most of it is green. 2017 is slightly better than 2017. 2017 is slightly better than 2016. The big sort of circles, green ones, are tenure less than 1 year. And that's against a base of sort of mid-career. So people right at the start of their journey within banks have very high perceptions of almost everything. And then reality starts hitting. Okay? Now, the good thing is, right at the end, there is some improvement. But by the way, this is not untypical of engagement surveys as well, to some extent. Line managers have much more positive perceptions than anybody else. So this is sort of the way we present some of this data. But this is not the only thing we have. We've talked to 1,500 people. What do? We have focus groups where we know which bank, which area the focus group's from. We have fairly open conversations without us leading them, but on specific themes. Then we explore the themes. Let's say that we were looking at well-being. And we have survey scores. These people, right at the bottom, don't feel under excess pressure to perform at work. Those people right at the top they do feel under excessive pressure to perform at work. And so what we do is we just take focus groups from the bottom, we just take focus groups from the top. Now, throwing away data seems scary, right? Oh, we're going to throw away all the data from the middle. But if you don't throw it away, how are you going to understand what's really the difference between good and bad performing environments? So this is what we do. We take focus groups from the top, focus groups from the bottom. That still gives us loads and loads of data. And then what our assessors do is they code this stuff line by line to say these are the causes behind these things. We look at intercoder reliability. We work with the London School of Economics to say, as sounding boards, at the end of this, we can say, for specific themes, hey, you know, these practices, they come up only in the high-scoring firms and not in the other ones. Therefore, this is likely to be associated with good versus bad. So you can take data, which is not data in your language or our common language, but still try to be as objective as possible through mixed methods. So I'll just say one more thing about this, which is, what do we actually find for things like well-being? You know, the greatest differentiator for people with negative health or pressure versus, good health, less pressure or whatever, it's not that they have support services available for them in their firms. The greatest differentiator that we find is organizational justice or fairness. These people live in environments which are fair, where their organization they think is just, and these people don't. Now that to us, as a first factor, was a surprise. But there's many different types of fairness as well, and we find loads of nuances like that. Before we finish, I'm going to pass over to Celia to talk about one of the spaces that we're moving in now. A lot of the discussion, the debate about ethics and morality, especially in banking, has been around incentives. What we're now trying to do is apply a behavioral science lens to this. And part of this is intervention testing, right? What works, what doesn't work. Real science applied to things like ethical behavior, speaking up, and so on. But more widely than this, how do we apply the behavioral science lens? Why should we apply the behavioral science lens, and what do we know?
Well, I think it's interesting that Moore wanted me to talk about this because he's just set up an amazing behavioral insights unit within the Banking Standards Board. So the reason why I'm excited about it as an associate of the BSB is that we need to assess this fuzzy thing called culture, and I think the BSB does a great job of triangulating across multiple methods to make sure that they're accessing this very difficult to grasp concept as objectively and clearly as possible. But what we really don't know is what makes things better. And we don't know this in the ethics space more so than in the other spaces. Because if you go, and I've been an academic who's studied this in organizations for over a decade, I go to an organization and say, I'd like to do an experiment inside your organization about how to create more ethical behavior. They say, what? Right? And they close their door in my face. So, but then I try to explain, we don't know what will make things better until you give us the chance to do one thing with one group and one thing with another group and see if things are different in the two groups at the end. And so I think it's really brave that the Banking Standards Board has set up this unit and developed the trust with so many financial institutions over the past several years, because it gives us the opportunity to really try and figure out causally if different interventions can actually create more safe environments for people to speak up, or be more willing to defy authority if they feel they're being asked to do something that goes against the true principles of the bank or against customer centricity. We really won't know until we can test this sort of intervention level if what we think works. Because in the meantime, what we're left with is, over time, these things tend to be correlated with these other things, so we can sort of think that maybe X leads to Y, but that doesn't give us the proof we need to go in and with empirical authority actually tell organizations how to become better places, both to work and for society. I think we're late.
Thank you very much.